Okay. Excellent. Welcome. My name is Elani Casey. I'm the board chair of the Naukani Native Program. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about our program. Naukani Native Program is led by Native people. We recognize the deep cultural conflicts that exist between mainstream society and the Native Americans, or Alaska Natives, Indigenous people. Consequently, we advocate for equity and social justice so that we can enhance our lives, build our resilience, and contribute to the survival of all. Naukani is a Tlingit word for a person or an entity which serves as a go-between or a connector for different people and cultures. Some of our programs we operate are Building Bridges Between Cultures, which is a workshop that I offer, and I gave one earlier today for King County. And also we advocate for tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. We support the tribal canoe journey, which has been on hold this year because of COVID-19. We're also in partnership with Healthier Here, the Medicaid Transformation, and we received funding recently to offer food assistance, and so we're doing a food delivery. And so we are so glad that you're here. I'm going to do a very brief welcoming song with my drum. It's to honor all of you and to welcome all of you today. Way, 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 ah, hey. Way, 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 ah, hey. Ah, 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 way, ah, hey. Way, ah, hey. Way, 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 ah, hey. Way, 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 ah, hey. Ah, 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 way, ah, hey, way, ah, hey, way, 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 ah, hey, way, 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 ah, hey, ah, 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 way, ah, hey, way, ah, hey. Ganeshjish, that's a Tlingit word that means thank you, Ganeshjish. And now I'm going to pass it over to Jeff Smith. He's our executive director of the Naukani Native Program. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Jeff, and I'm going to introduce Dina, and she's a member of the Colville Confederated Tribes, and she's going to talk about how irresponsible mining and the use of petroleum's harming traditional indigenous ways of life, and also how our people could turn away from planet-destroying industrial agriculture and learn to live in right relationship with Mother Earth. She is the author of As Long as the Grass Grows, the Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock, and co-author with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz of All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 other myths about Native Americans. So I'm really glad to welcome you today, Dina. So take it away.
All right, Lemle, Jeffrey, Y, Peace Nuxil, Kui Squeeze, Dina Gilio-Whitaker. And I am coming to you from the traditional homelands of the Ohashiman and Waneno people in Southern California, in Orange County, the place known to them as Panhe, AKA San Clemente. So that's where I currently live. I was born and raised in Southern California as a result, so I consider myself an urban Indian as a result of federal termination policy of the 1950s and 60s. And my mother was from the Colville Reservation, and so I consider myself first generation off the res. That's kind of how I say it. Let's see, I teach American Indian Studies at Cal State San Marcos down here, which is in San Diego County. Where I live borders on San Diego County. And I also have a consulting business. I do a lot of outside work outside the university, working with organizations, doing all kinds of things relating, things like, talks like this. Or sometimes I'll work with, nonprofit organizations. I'll do staff trainings or professional development training with educators. My work is predominantly education. I came out of I came out of my previous life as an academic. Prior to my life as an academic, I was in the art world. I was also a journalist, so I have kind of a varied background. But when you get to my age, like you kind of do, that's what happens. You accumulate careers and vocations, and so that's kind of all of that I bring to my work now. And I've always considered myself an environmentalist. As a Native person, I take it seriously, all the things that I've been taught. Even though I wasn't raised with a lot of my culture, I had to come back to it as an adult. But I always had the message about how important land is and our connection to land. And that doesn't mean us as Native people, although for me, it does. It first and foremost means that, but it's also about how our connection to land as human beings, like all of us, we are all connected to land in various ways. And so these are the kinds of things that I bring to my teaching. I teach courses at San Marcos. I teach our environmental courses. I teach two of those, and one of them is a traditional ecological knowledge course, and more of my work is going in that direction as an educator and as a writer. Let's see, what else can I say that's kind of background information. Well, you'll see as the presentation unfolds. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Is that visible to everyone? Yeah, I'm seeing nodding heads. Okay, great.
Looks good, looks good.
Okay, excellent. So this is something I do a lot as a teacher. We have been online teaching since last spring with the COVID crisis and the quarantine. We were in the middle of our semester when the quarantine orders came down, and so we had to rush to turn all our courses online. So fortunately, I have a lot of experience with this. My presentation to you, I mean, the formal title of it, you can see here. I know that Nakhani has a focus on, or my understanding is that Nakhani's sort of mission is focusing on fossil fuels and the harms to the environment, which is a really, really huge conversation, and it means different things in different places. And I'll get into that in just a little while too. But so I'm sort of bringing together the work that I've done in this last book, As Long as Grass Grows, which is, let me share it with you right now, right here. This is the book. I don't think I included it. I might have in the next slide, I can't remember, but this is the book right here that we're talking about. This came out last year. And As Long as Grass Grows, the Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. And it comes directly out of my work as an undergrad and grad school. And I will say that I went back to school late in life. After this long career as an artist, I went back to school and just got deep into my writing as I came out of this journalism background also, the same time I was an artist and doing different kinds of work with tribal communities, just as a community member and activist. But so the book just builds on, like, you know, decades of passion about the environment, and then learning more and more about tribal sovereignty and, you know, Native people's actual relationship to the United States. And so this is the accumulation of years and years of studying and experience, you know, lived experience. And then also a new book that I'm working on right now. I'm under contract with Beacon Press, which is my the publisher of my previous two books. And the title of that book is tentative, although I really like it, and I think it's going to stick. It's called Illegitimate Nation: Confronting Settler Privilege and Moving Toward a Transformational Land Ethic. And I'm going to talk about that at the very end of, you know, what a transformational land ethic is at the end of this presentation. So this is sort of combining the work of this last book and this new work that is happening. So that's sort of my introduction here. Let's go. Okay, yeah, there's the slide. I did include that. So sort of a overview of what this book is about is I was a student of environmental justice as an undergrad, and then also as a graduate student, you know, 15 years ago. And I was really, I had taken two classes, you know, at that time. That was all that was available, you know, in American Indian Studies, a program I came out of in New Mexico, and then my grad program, which was American Studies. And so I had taken the two classes that one in each of those programs, and I was really like kind of disturbed that we were not reading Native authors in this field of environmental justice. Even in that environmental justice class in the American Indian Studies program I came out of, there was only maybe 2 Native authors that we read, and the rest of it was material that was sort of peripherally related to environmental justice. Then by the time I got into grad school and I had taken that class, and we read no Native authors at all. So there was this massive hole in the literature, in the environmental justice literature, that was really frustrating to me. So the longer I stayed in school, the more my research focused on environmental justice issues. And so I did a master's thesis basically theorizing what environmental justice, indigenizing it, right? What an indigenized environmental justice discourse would look like. So that's basically, that turned into this book. So this book, there's a chapter in there on sacred sites and the protection of sacred sites as an environmental justice issue. And that was actually the master's thesis. And then when I was asked to write this book by Beacon Press, because it was while Standing Rock was going on in 2016, and I was on book tour with Roxanne for our other book, and Beacon was like, what does environmental justice look like from an Indigenous perspective? And they knew my work, and so they had asked me to write this book. So basically this book is sort of two things, and one of those things is the book that I wished I'd had when I was a student, and then the other thing is that it's totally lost my train of thought, but it's what if I had gone into a PhD program, and there's all kinds of reasons why I decided against that, this is a potential version of what a PhD dissertation would have looked like. So the expansion of that work I had done in the master's thesis. So that's the sort of backstory to this book. What the book does is it through indigenizing this approach to environmental justice. And when I say environmental justice, what we're talking about, that's a very broad term, and it basically encompasses activism. It encompasses theory, like academic theory. So it's discourse. It's discourse that's theory, activism, and law and policy. So there's all these different realms that we talk about environmental justice within. And so what I had learned, and what was so frustrating for me when I was studying this as a student, was that none of the literature was addressing what environmental justice meant for Native people. Like it had this, it's very well laid out for other communities, ethnic minority communities, especially Black and Hispanic communities, because that's where environmental justice as a theory and discourse emerged from. It emerged from the South, the Black South, because of the activism down there with people resisting the siting of toxic waste dumps in the early 80s and other things prior to that. You know, for Hispanic communities, it was, for example, the issues associated with farm workers and being poisoned with pesticides that they were having to work with. So environmental justice or injustice plays out in different ways for different communities, different ethnic communities. The difference for Native people is that Native people are nations with political relationships to the state. And that's something that none of this theory was taking into consideration. It treated us as Native people like just another ethnic minority group. And that is really inaccurate, and it's really dangerous in the big picture, because that's a reduction of who we actually are and our government to government relationship with the United States. That's what needs to be brought into this conversation, and that's what I do in this book. And so the differences are, like, not only are we nations with political relationships to the state, and we say government to government relationships, but we have very, very different histories with that government. We are pre-existing people, of course, obviously, you know, with ancient tenure on the land. We have very, very different relationships to the land. We know there's no other groups in the United States that have the same kind of relationship that we do as Native nations to the land, because Native people invariably consider themselves part of the land, right? If you look at the language in, you know, almost straight across the board, the names that Native people have for themselves very frequently translate to the people of a certain place, right? So it's this framework of indigeneity, is the framework of understanding yourself, your community, your people, your history as connected to place. And this constructs an entirely different kind of, we use this word epistemology. This is a fancy academic word that simply means system of knowledge. And so our orientation to the world is very different than it is for those who are arrivants, people who come from other places, and, you know, who have, and then who, you know, in very violent ways take the land for themselves and commit genocide and land theft and all of that. So all of these things need to be factored into what environmental justice looks like for Native people. That's That's the foundation. Okay, so in the book, what I do, let me minimize that. One of the ways that I reframe this conversation is to understand, to lay out the historical foundation of how things come to be in the United States. And, you know, we hear this, we are all familiar, we've all been taught this history about Western expansion, right? Western expansion is, you know, the march westward from the East as populations were growing, and the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, we know, is this, you know, explosion in technology that makes the population boom, you know, partly possible. It's partly that makes this this massive population growth here possible. And, you know, it happens through the innovations of new technologies. You know, I write about the cotton gin, which changes the economy in the South and you know, expands the slave trade. And you know, there are all kinds of other technologies that arise during the 19th century and late 19th century. And we're think about the railroads, for example. The railroads are a huge part of what makes the opening of the West possible. And in it also at the same time, so it's this narrative of progress, right? Moving west is narratives of progress, where this is modernity. Modernity is modern humans, modern American life, that is made possible through these innovations in technology, you know, with the railroads and with all these other kinds of machinery, but also with things like dams. And so I talk in the book a lot about dams and mining technology, because they have very particular hard-hitting impacts for Native people. And we call this, it's been called ecocide. So ecocide is, you know, the combining of words that come from ecosystem. So ecocide is the killing of the ecosystem, but it's, for Native people, it's always hand in hand with genocide. So the killing of an ecocide, you know, in tandem with the impacts to indigenous nations. So I talk about, you know, because I come from a people, you know, the Colville Confederated Tribes, we are people of the Northern Columbia or the Upper Columbia Plateau region. We are salmon people, we are river people. We know ourselves as connected to the salmon in the same way that Plains people are connected to the buffalo, for example. And so that's how, and you know, this is true for all other people of the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest, people who are salmon people. And we had, on our reservation, we had the building of a dam called the Grand Coulee Dam that happened in the 30s, and it was completed in around 1940. And that dam at the time was the largest dam in the world. It was celebrated as this, you know, engineering wonder, one of the wonders of the world, and it created this massive lake now called Lake Roosevelt. But what it also did was that in creating this big lake is it flooded this place called the Kettle Falls. And the Kettle Falls was the center of our culture. It was a major, major salmon fishery that had been the center of the cultures in that region for thousands of years. And when with the creating of that lake, it drowned the falls. So no longer do we have access to that fishery. This is an act of cultural genocide. This is one of many, many incidents that we can talk about. all over Turtle Island. And it had massive impact to our people. Like, it's sort of like ripping the heart out of a culture. You don't have the salmon, like there's no salmon runs anymore because of this big dam. And the same thing happened on the lower Columbia River with the building of the Dalles Dam in around just a few years later, actually. And it was, considered, like so many of these projects are framed as sort of sacrifices, like Native people, Native peoples are expected to sacrifice for the betterment of all settlers, of all America, right? But the bottom line with that is that it's about, as we have these narratives of progress, what it is it's cultural genocide for Native people. Everybody else benefits while Native people sacrifice. And so that's what this image is right here in the Columbia River Basin. This is the entire Columbia River watershed, which you can see the scale of it, reaching well into British Columbia here, and then well into Montana, Idaho, down into even parts of Wyoming, over here to the east, and then Oregon. The Columbia River watershed has over 60 dams that have been built on it, and that's had massive ecological effects, leading to salmon populations now being endangered, almost extinct in some species, which is a ecological, most people probably know that to some degree or another. Salmon is a keystone species, which means that when salmon populations collapse, it leads to the collapse of other ecosystems and species. So this is a huge problem that's being, trying to be dealt with right now, and including the talk about dam removal. And it's very controversial, and there are some dams that are being and have been removed. The Elwha Dam in Washington is one of them, over in the west part of the state, in the Olympic Peninsula. And there are dams in Northern California, because the salmon problem is not just in the Columbia River, but it's also in like the Klamath River, major salmon collapsing populations there too. So that's one kind of ecological problem that leads to this cultural genocidal impact. Over here on this image on the left is another kind of ecocidal event and ongoing problem with the Pick Sloan dams. I wrote about this in the book. If you followed the Standing Rock controversy, you will likely know that Lake Oahe was the lake that was the center of conflict about the pipeline going under the lake, which is right here. So right here, Lake Oahe. And the Pick Sloan Act was passed in the 1940s, and all it did was created 5 dams, just 5 dams, but it created this massive flooding that created these different lakes, but it flooded major areas of tribal territory of the Great Sioux Nation, the Sioux people. And others too, including up here at Fort Berthold, right, which are MHA Mandan Hidatsa Arikara people. So this had a different kind of impact for those people, because it displaced so many people. The flooding of the lands, the people mostly lived in those bottom lands, and then when they flooded those lands, all those people had to move, and we're talking thousands of people. Over, as Nick Estes writes, over 900 families were removed for these hydro projects. And so this is sort of the bigger picture of and historical context for Standing Rock. And then over here, this image on the right, this is about the uranium mining, and I write about this a lot in the book too. Uranium mining has impacted numerous tribal regions. We're most familiar, for those of you who know about that, probably know about it in the Southwest. Here in this region, this is the Four Corners region. You can see all these black dots are uranium mines and abandoned uranium mines. The virtually all of the thousands of uranium mines that were abandoned were unremediated, meaning they were not cleaned up. So you have all these this toxic mine tailings left open like sores on the earth, blowing in the wind and leaching into the waters, and making poisoning the environment and poisoning people. So, so the Colorado Plateau, that's this entire area. That's where most of it exists. But relative to tribal people, up here in the Northwest, we see a concentration of it too. Here we're talking about the Midnight Mine, and we're also talking about the Hanford facility, which of course has been leaking. That's a major environmental catastrophe, continuing to leach out into the environment. But that Midnight Mine has had severe impacts it's close to the Culver Reservation and the Spokane Reservation, and the Yakimas as well. So these are ongoing impacts. This is the ways that toxic extractivism continues to harm Native people. There's a whole other history, there's a whole other history too that we could talk about relative to fossil fuels, that is sort of encapsulated in the story about the Osage oil boom of the late 19th century, early 20th century. And the book, for example, Killers of the Flower Moon by Daniel Grant, I think is his name. And it's now being turned into a movie, actually, pretty major production. But this environmental injustice, the kind of the big picture here is that for Native people, environmental injustice encompasses these much larger histories of not only being pushed off their lands, and that's the beginning of it, like being forcibly displaced from your homelands and your ability to feed yourself and to perpetuate your community life. That is an environmental injustice for Native people. That's sort of the focus of that piece of it, that Native people, it's a much bigger problem than just being poisoned. Being poisoned is only one of the problems. And that Osage oil boom, and the murders that happened with that, were certainly one of the earliest incidents of all of that. And so, this image is so important to all of this. We're talking about, when we talk about Western expansion and the Industrial Revolution, this image kind of encapsulates all of that visually. I think most of us are aware of this image. We know this image. It's the sort of embodiment of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny, which is the religious imperative for settlers to conquer the land and tame the land and legitimize the taking of the land. And so, so the way that all this happens is through these long processes of understanding Native peoples, Indigenous people, as being inferior, as being not deserving of the land, first of all, because they're not Christians. that's really how it started. It's not a racial thing, and this is one of the things I'm very adamant about pointing out, and will do in the next book. Understanding, because of that concept of settler privilege, you know, it's detaching ourselves from that racialized framework, that it's not that Native people, that Native nations are not these racialized ethnic minorities, but this political relationship. And so when we talk about privilege, like decoupling that the race, the privileging of people based on race, it's part of that, but it's not the entire picture, because for Native people, the genocide that gets unleashed against us is not predominantly because we are racially different. It's because we have the land. And it begins with the recognition of us as non-Christian people. You go back centuries to well before settlers even came here, with the Roman Catholic Church and the Papal Bulls that create this structure, this framework for justifying this violent takeover of lands that they hadn't even come to yet. So that's what the Papal Bulls were. They knew that when they set out on these voyages of, you know, quote unquote discovery, that they were going to encounter people, and they knew that those people weren't going to be Christians. They weren't going to be Christianized, because Christians hadn't gotten there yet. This was going to be the first encounter between Christians and these, you know, heathens and savages. And so they construct this whole framework for how they're going to justify the taking of the land and the enslavement of those people when they resist that taking of the land. And it's because they're not Christians. That's a really important point, and that point hasn't really been made strongly yet in our historiography, in our humanities, literature. And so this is something that needs to really be emphasized. It's also what makes our relationship different than that of the Black community. So, it's really important to talk about how our experience as oppressed people in the United States really differs, and that's the point of one of the important points of this. And so this inferiorization of Native people gets, it starts with the Catholic Church in the Papal Bulls, but it also gets encoded into federal law with the very first Supreme Court decision in Johnson v. McIntosh, and then the subsequent two next Indian decisions of the Supreme Court in 1831 and 1832, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and then also the Cherokee versus Worcester decisions. And so, but it's that first decision in 1823, the Johnson decision, where the doctrine of discovery is first articulated. And that's the core of what this doctrine is. It's establishing the legitimizing of the violent takeover of native lands by settler people because they're not Christians. And the Christianizing, the bringing of Christianity is what justifies this process. So and then the foundation is laid for this entire legal structure that maintains this paternalistic and hegemonic, meaning controlling relationship between the US and tribal nations. and that to this day still constructs that relationship. And that's why we call it settler colonialism, because it crystallizes into a structure that ongoingly perpetuates these patterns of behavior and continually seeks to eliminate our existence and then ultimately take our land. So it's an ongoing, never-ending process. Okay, what is white supremacy? And I just got done saying that it's really not about race, but that it is. I mean, it has a complicated relationship to race. Because we are talking about white supremacy. I mean, we are talking about religious and cultural supremacy, but racial supremacy is part of this. And especially as the nation grows older and, you know, race becomes more and more a part of how the United States understands itself. And here I'm thinking about the advent of the academic field of anthropology, which happens in the mid 1800s, and the classifications of categories of humans by this, you know, artificial construct we call race. And of course, that's about, you know, the hierarchies based on this idea that there are like ideal humans and then there are subhumans. And always white Europeans are at the top of that pyramid. You know, this is this theory of development, human development. And, you know, white people, white Europeans are at the pinnacle of human civilization. And then everybody else is somewhere below them on this ladder of hierarchy. And, you know, indigenous and Black people are always at the bottom of that hierarchy. And because of that, they are in need of improvement. For Native people, that's the case. And for Black people, it's really more about keeping them separate. But Native people are seen as assimilable. That's a whole other conversation, but this has been written about in terms of scientific racism. The scholar Reginald Horseman, I think that's what his name was, coined that phrase many, many years ago to describe anthropology, the beginning of anthropology. So this white supremacy, this white cultural and religious supremacy is what forms the foundation for American society, especially throughout the 19th century. And it infuses itself into what became or what evolved into the conservation and preservation movements beginning in, you know, around the 1870s, while Western expansion was happening and populations are, you know, wildly moving to the West because of all this urbanization happening in the East. And along with that comes all this angst about disappearing environments and wilderness areas and degrading environmental conditions. So all of this stuff is happening at the same time. But it's also happening concurrently with this very, very aggressive military project to push Native people off their lands. And, you know, this is happening through the so-called Indian Wars. And the railroad is key to that. The railroads are what make that possible, of pushing Native people off their lands to then impose these very aggressively imposed treaties on them to force people to Native people to cede their lands, to open the way for this vast migration of Western expansion. And so all of these processes tied together, you know, come together at this time. And, you know, we have people in the environmental, you know, at that time, this proto-environmental movement that we talk about with conservation and preservation. Henry David Thoreau is considered sort of the father of the modern environmental movement. He's a very progressive man from the Northeast. He's an abolitionist. He's considered, you know, he's a hero in American iconography and historiography. And so he's very much revered, and he wrote a lot about Native peoples, especially in a book called The Maine Woods. He talks about these Penobscot friends that he had, and he's sort of fixated on Native people, and he has this idea that Native people really knew how to live in harmony with the environment, and that was true. But there were also things that he didn't see, and ultimately, he was a Christian, and he still believed in the fact that Native people were, you know, lower down on that hierarchy of civilization, and that they needed Christianity to improve them. And he believed that Native people were destined to fade away as they became civilized. So I write about that in there, uncover that history. And then John Muir, you know, this is who this is. This image is here. You know, I have this very interesting conversation about John Muir in the last month or so at the Sierra Club, distancing themselves from him, even though he was one of the founders, of the predominant founder of that organization in 1892. He was well known for being a man of his time, which was being very racist. And this is the word we use that would never have been used back then, but this is how we understand him now. And so, you know, because of the current moment that we're in with the Black Lives Matter movement and this renewed ethnic kind of angst that this country is going through, and you know, for good reason. So all these conversations are back up in our faces again, and all these things are being like revisited. And you know, John Muir for the environmental movement, you know, is sort of the face of that. And so this is why, you know, because he was so well known for being a racist, and he was that way for Native people as well. He was raised a Calvinist. Very conservative Christian family from Scotland. He came to California, and he had this, you know, this experience with the wilderness that, you know, shaped who he was and the work that he did. But he didn't like California Indians. He thought them inferior in all the same kinds of ways that, you know, people before him did. He didn't understand them, and he just felt that they were, you know, they were, you know, kind of subhuman. He didn't appreciate them, that's for sure. And he, not only that, but so he gets to California at a time when this genocide this open genocide is happening in California. And my critique about him is that he doesn't ever seem to oppose that. And that's my beef with John Muir, is that yes, he's a man of his times. That's not to excuse those times when pretty much all white people were embodied some aspect of white supremacy. The vast majority of people did, but he never spoke out against the genocide, and he was all for pushing Indians out of Yosemite Valley, and that's a problem. So for me, John Muir is not redeemable. I've been getting a lot of requests for interviews lately about this, and I really sense, and they're always from white people, white journalists and environmentalists, and they some of them have so much angst about this, you know, like, you know, the demoting of one of their most important revered heroes. And it's hard for them, like they need their heroes, and they want to hear somebody like me, you know, kind of tell them that it's okay, you know, he didn't mean it or whatever. And I don't do that. He is who he is, and I think it's important to have these critical conversations. And I'm not here to make people feel comfortable or good about that. So I'm unapologetic. And so the environmental movement, as I write about this in the book, there's a whole chapter about how the environmental movement evolves, you know, into second wave environmentalism during the 1960s with the Back to the Land movement. And, you know, this happens in parallel to the ethnic nationalist movements and the civil rights movement. All this stuff is happening at the same time. There's a new sensibility emerging in the United States. And, you know, the hippies are going back to the land, and they're more progressive, and they're changing the conversation in the US in a lot of ways. But they still bring with them this unconscious white bias, this white supremacy, because that's who that movement is largely is. It's disaffected white youth. And that's why the Back to the Land movement happens, because they're rejecting the conservative values of their parents' generation, and they want a different kind of life, and they start looking to Indian country for that. They look to Native Americans, and so there's this renewed respect, yes, for the way Native people lived harmoniously with the land, but it comes with all this weird, convoluted stuff that turns basically into cultural appropriation and fetishism, and ultimately these are forms of erasure. And they come with all kinds of problems. And inevitably, it's sort of a reenactment of this pioneer mentality. And that's why I put this image here. I had never seen this book before, but you can see by the title how that pioneer narrative is so deeply ingrained in the American psyche that it's not even thought about critically, like, oh, proud pioneers conquering nature, right? That's America, without ever thinking that it's those pioneers that were responsible for the genocide that was being perpetuated. So again, this is part of how the second wave environmentalist movement really is not reflexive about this and repeats many of these same patterns, whether they know it or not. Okay, so in the book, I talk about fossil fuel production, and I talk about it in terms of being a Faustian bargain. Or I raise the question, is this a Faustian bargain? Meaning, a Faustian bargain is basically a deal with the devil. You know, and it begins in, you know, recently in 2006. That's when the Bakken oil field is really discovered. And, you know, who's sitting on top of the Bakken oil field? Well, it's, you know, Fort Berthold Reservation. And 17% of all the oil that comes out of the Bakken oil field is Fort Berthold, is on the reservation there. And, you know, it's been, you know, there are pros and cons to it, right? I mean, the pros is that it's, you know, provided economic development for an otherwise very, very destitute community. And the exercise of sovereignty comes with that. At the same time, the cons with it is that it has led to this massive environmental destruction. The poisoning of their lands and waters is very startling. And the man camps that came with it, that's the image you have here, is one of those giant man camps, which, as you probably know, have contributed to the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Just to point you for a reference here for more about this, there's a film on Amazon Prime called A Different American Dream, and it's a really hard look at the environmental devastation on the Fort Berthold Reservation. It's a very stark look at it. And then this little this is called Field of Vision Nuka. It's a YouTube video. It's like short. It's 12 minutes long, but it gives sort of an experimental film feel look at this too, about what's going on there. Okay, on the other hand, we have you know, for Native people is like seeing the fossil fuel development as sort of that Faustian bargain. On the other side of that is, you know, the knowledge that has been handed down in our communities and our nations since time immemorial, and this knowledge has been called the original instructions, and that's taken from a book by I've got the book right here. This might be a good resource also. This book, can you see my screen, or can you see if I hold this up to my camera? Is this visible? Let's see.
I can see it.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is a really great resource book called Original Instructions, Indigenous Teachings for a Sustainable Future. It's a little bit older, but it's so worth having in your library. It's not heavily academic. It's very much community-based, and talks about, there's lots of different essays in there that talk about, you know, what the original instructions are, and you know, different aspects of that, and reiterating that we have always had that knowledge that even though the processes of colonization have been devastating to all of our communities, we have still retained the knowledge that we need to survive, and this is about our relationship to the natural world that made us ultimately sustainable societies. Indigenous peoples, by virtue of the fact that we lived on lands for thousands and thousands of years, that is the definition of sustainability. The ability to sustain yourself as a people for that long. I told you that I teach a course at San Marcos on traditional ecological knowledge. We for 16 weeks we dive deep into it. We go out into the community, into the tribal communities in San Diego County, because we have the most Indian reservations per county than anywhere else in the United States, which is a great resource for an American Indian Studies program like ours. This is this top photograph. Well, both of these photographs are photos from one of our site visits. This is our students being taught by Native people. This particular one is a place at the Palma Reservation, an organic farm that they have there, and they're doing all kinds of really interesting farming techniques and bringing back indigenous plants to help with their in their land management and their farm practices there. So this is the photograph on the bottom here is a part of the farm. And so all of this all together is, we're talking about decolonizing environmental justice. So we're indigenizing it, like by incorporating all these aspects of Native life, Native realities, and also decolonizing it. And that's really, you know, part of what was happening at Standing Rock. At Standing Rock was, you know, it was such a watershed moment, because nothing quite like that had ever happened before. It was really a moment in time where the world's eyes were turned to us. I mean, we have had moments like that before in the, you know, during the Red Power movement in the 1960s, with things like the Alcatraz Island occupation, Wounded Knee, the Trail of Broken Treaties. You know, the 70s were a really rich time for that. But this mirrored that, but it's at a different level and a more sort of sophisticated level, because of the reality of climate change and the reality and the knowledge of fossil fuels and how devastating fossil fuels have been to all of us everywhere on the planet. And so it's a moment for us to really start looking at, you know, and not just as Native people or even the United States, but the world in general, about how how the knowledge that Indigenous peoples have the power and the possibility to change the way that we all live on the planet. That's really what concerns me right now. That's the work I'm really trying to do, is highlight that, empower that, uplift it. And that's also the work that, you know, and to say, you know, governments and science need to pay attention to the knowledge that we have, our own native sciences. We have our own sciences that you need to pay attention to. And it's starting to happen slowly but surely. And while we're doing that, we need to talk about our rights. And here I'm talking about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how it enshrines the right of self-determination, but also the right of free, prior, and informed consent. This is a very important point. This is different than consultation. We need more than just consultation in these, especially relative to development projects. The United States endorsed the declaration and in theory endorsed the idea of consent, but they don't take it seriously, and Standing Rock was the living example of that. And so coming to what it means to have a transformational land ethic, here I'm building on these two particular articulations of land ethic. And, you know, in the environmental movement, they know this concept coming from Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold came after, you know, shortly after John Muir. He was a contemporary in the early 20th century, and he worked for the federal government. He was a biologist and naturalist, and he is known for writing this book called the Sand County Almanac. And in that book, posthumously was added an essay that he wrote called The Land Ethic. And in that he talks about how the human, you know, the way the United States, the way people relate to the land in this very exploitative way, we need to understand ourselves. We need to accord respect to the natural world. That's really what he's saying, that's what a land ethic is. And he says, all ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. Well, this is something Native people have always known, right? And it's almost laughable that the environmental movement would just latch on to this and he would become such a hero, because that's the philosophy that Indigenous knowledge is based on, and why everybody, you know, like the second wave environmental back to the land movement, respected Native people so much. So this is a focus on the land itself. And N. Scott Momaday, of course, is the very well-known literary Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, and he wrote an essay in 1997 called An American Land Ethic, and he's writing about somebody named Kosan. And Kosan was a character from one of his books who was also a relative, an elder relative of his, and he's writing about her, and he says, in Kosan and her people, we have always had the example of a deep ethical regard for the land. We had better learn from it. Surely that ethic is merely latent in ourselves. It must now be activated, I believe. We Americans must come again to a moral comprehension of the earth and air. We must live accordingly to a principle of a land ethic. The alternative is that we shall not live at all. And who can't agree to that, especially in the current moment? The difference, I mean, so they're basically saying the same thing from very, very different perspectives. But what's not being said here, and what hasn't happened, is a reckoning for America's history of violent accumulation of land through genocide. And that's the one thing that has not been reckoned with in the United States. And so my argument is that until the United States reckons with that history and includes indigenous peoples as part of that land ethic, and accounting for that history, and then we cannot possibly have a just land ethic. So it's really about a just land ethic that that understands indigenous native people, American Indian people, and nations as the original people that have rights that need to be respected. So that's where this is all going. I'm gonna stop there. I think we have time. I wanted to kind of breeze through that so that we had time to have a conversation. And I'm going to share this last slide. This is my contact information. I can be reached at this email. My website is dgwconsulting.org, and then there's my Facebook and Twitter handle. So I'm going to go ahead and show this while we're all still viewing the screen. So totally open to questions. I don't know if Jeff or Elaine, you want to moderate that?
There are a few questions. Some we were able to answer while you were speaking, but there were a couple of questions that they wanted to know the name of the case, 1831 and 1823, so we kind of answered that.
It's all in the book too, by the way.
It's all in the book.
All of that.
Right. And then in the chat, we did put your contact info, your title and everything. And they asked, how would you suggest we new pioneers not recreate the same issues? How can we turn to for collaboration without seeming intrusive with respect to the natives?
Right, that's always, that's a big question, right? That's sort of the $1 million question, and it gets articulated in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of ways to do that, and it always really first becomes a matter of education, of educating yourself as to the actual history of this country and the foundations of it, and the scaffolding that maintains this relationship of domination of the United States over Native people. And it's a very complicated relationship, actually, because there is such a thing as tribal sovereignty, right? There is a legal foundation for that, where the federal government does have, some measure of respect for that, and it is written into the legal structure. But there are other pieces of that complicate it and hamper Native people's ability to be, to have political power. That doesn't answer your question, but understanding the history is a really important part of it. And then finding ways that in your own, if you're an activist, and pretty much if you're politically active at all, that's all being an activist means. So finding the ways that speak to you to do the work that you do, especially if you do environmental activism, if that's your calling or your passion, finding ways that you can work alongside Native people. And I think that's really the key is, sort of understanding what it means to be an ally, and a co-conspirator. That's kind of a term that gets used a lot these days, but working with Native people and listening to Native people, and understanding that the processes of decolonizing all of this stuff will be uncomfortable. They're not going to be comfortable for you and I'll give you an example of what I do in my class when I teach students in this traditional ecological knowledge class. And it's not just that class, but I do this in other trainings that I do with people. is I ask them, what is your relationship to land and place and to indigenous people of that place? How do you come to be who you are and to be on the lands that you are on? What were the processes that enabled that? And what is your accountability to that? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about accountability, about the United States accounting for this very horrible, horrible history and ongoing structure. So how do you embody that, right? And how do you benefit from that? Because everybody benefits from it in one way or another. I benefit, even though I'm Native, I benefit from it by living where I live. I mean, I live on a Hashiman land. So that means, what is my responsibility? Like in an indigenous knowledge system, I consider myself responsible to them. Like, how do I enact that responsibility? How can I be a good relative to them? Because that's how Native people, that's the core of our worldview, is about kinship and relationship and being responsible. So my work is always informed by that question, and I do it in a lot of different ways, and yeah, that's another conversation entirely. But I would submit to you that those are the questions that you ask yourself, and they're not easy questions, and they will make you uncomfortable. And so if you can learn to live with that discomfort, but knowing that that's the work, the ethical work that needs to be done. I hope that helps.
And someone asked about the Original Instructions, Indigenous Teachings for a Sustainable Future book by Melissa K. Nelson.
Mm-hmm.
So we put that in the chat. And they asked about your book. So I gave them the title of your book. And let's see. There was a question about Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831, and then Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823.
Okay, what is the question?
They were just wanting clarification of those. I understand that the McIntosh one is a really big deal. It made a big change in our historical connection with the U.S. government.
Right, so those first three, can you hold on a second? I've got too much noise in the background. I'm going to have them quiet. Oh, the joys of working from home. So those first three decisions I referenced are called the Marshall Trilogy, and they are that foundational scaffolding of the legal system. And they articulated, the first one was the Doctrine of Discovery, which basically is providing that justification for the violent taking of land, that by virtue of religious superiority, Europeans, didn't really, because they imparted Christianity on the natives, they didn't really have anything to apologize for. I mean, he actually uses that language. It afforded an apology. It's exactly the words that he used in that decision. And then the second legal principle that in Cherokee versus Georgia was the principle of domestic dependent nations. That's a construction where the United States, it's counter to the treaty relationship. The treaty relationship is based on, the nation to nation status, but the Supreme Court sort of twists it in this way that says, well, you know, now they're nations, but they're dependent nations. They're domestic, so they sort of created out of thin air, even though that's not what the treaty relationship is all about. And then, and I'm very, very much simplifying this, but this is how we teach this in school, in these programs. And then the Worcester decision was, they talked about, it was a kind of it was a compromise where they acknowledge, it's basically said that it prohibited states from making treaties with the tribes, and it imbued the federal government with the only authority, to be the only authority to make treaties and to conduct relationships between the federal government and the tribes. Very simplified there. And then you have, you know, that's the Marshall Trilogy. And then you have, of course, this all happens during the Indian relocation, the Removal Act, and the Trail of Treaties, Trail of Tears is happening. And, you know, then, you know, just a few years later, Manifest Destiny gets coined in 1840, and Western expansion is in full swing, and all these laws start getting passed. The federal government stops making treaties in 1871, and it gets increasingly more violent and more aggressive, and as does the Supreme Court and Congress. And so they create this whole fabric, or like structure of laws that diminish tribal sovereignty and independence.
Hey, Dina, this is Jeff Smith from the Connie Native Program. And I saw a book and I read part of it. It was where the author, who I believe was Native, said that he found papers, like in somebody's attic or something, from John Marshall, the Supreme Court Justice, that indicated that Justice Marshall actually owned, I think he owned land that was involved in one of those cases, and that would be a good reason for him to have a conflict of interest and rule against natives. Have you heard about that? Is that
that was
true?
Lindsay Robertson's book. Yeah, and it was a really important, that's a really important book, because it uncovers all this collusion and corruption of Justice Marshall, and his interest in creating these decisions, like plucking these ideas out of thin air. Part of the way those decisions have been written about by legal scholars is that also what was happening at the time was that the United States needed to establish clear title to the lands.
Yeah.
Right, and so it sets the it creates the structure, or like, you know, the foundation for land title, like clear land titles in the U.S. And so, yeah, it's hugely problematic. I mean, it's not only is it violent, but it's corrupt as hell. You know, and you know, we just had this crazy White House conference yesterday on history, and you know, it's got to be patriotic history, Trump and all of that. It's such BS, because like the way that history is taught right now is already it's so corrupt. It's so whitewashed and so erasive that, you know, all we're doing is correcting the histories and telling and filling it in and telling them from the perspective, the stuff that they left out, that they leave out, right? And then it's just so, it's so infuriating that whole thing happened. And
oh yeah, it's terrible. And now, you know, so is that going to make any difference, finding those papers? Is that going to make any difference in court cases? Is anybody bringing it up? And at least it seems like,
well, that happened years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're talking about the same thing, Lindsay Robertson wrote a whole book on it, and that came out years ago. So, I mean, I don't know what difference it makes other than let's just expose it. You know, like we can't, I mean, I, I mean, ultimately, like if we're talking about decolonization, what needs to happen is like, that's about dismantling the settler state, the structures of the settler state, you know, and that seems like something that like, oh my God, that could never happen. I personally don't believe that. I think anything can happen, but you have to, you know, what we're doing is we're thinking our ways through this. How do you change that relationship? I mean, we know that not everybody's going to go back to Europe and go back where they came from, and you know, we're going to get all of our land back. But at the same time, we can talk about things like land back, like this land back movement. Land does sometimes get given back, and sometimes it gets put in trust on the reservation. Sometimes it happens through land trusts, through conservancies, and all these different kinds of alternative arrangements that restore Indigenous governance to these lands. And so that's one of the things I write about in the last chapter of the book, talking about ways when we're talking about decolonizing environmental justice. It's really about decolonizing that political relationship.
Yes, and the name of the book that you guys are referring to, it's called Conquest by Law,
Yeah.
How the Discovery of America Dispossessed by Lindsay G. Robertson, and it was done back in 2007. And it's still available through, you know, a variety of,
Yeah.
you know, Goodreads and Amazon and Oxford. And
It's
then,
a very heavy read. I mean, this is
yeah,
not light reading. It's
no.
a legal scholarly read.
And there's a question here is, Patu was wondering, she's learned a tiny bit about the area you are based in. Are there Native students, including those of the area and elsewhere in your classes?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I always have Native students. We have a department. It's a not just a program, but we have a Native American Studies department, and a major. So so they take our classes, you know, and we're in the process. It's pretty new. We're in the process of growing it. So we do get, we in fact in our campus we did a study a few years ago and discovered that we have more Native students per capita on our campus than anywhere else in the state. And so, yeah, we're happy about that. And we have a center called the California Indian Culture and Sovereignty Center, and it's basically a research center. So we do not just only the teaching, but we do active community engaged participatory research, and we have a film festival. We do all kinds of stuff. We have an
Awesome.
amazing program. Yeah, it's really cool. And that reminds me, we have an event coming up next week, a week from today, called it's a it's a film screening. Since we're not doing an entire film festival this year, but we are doing a screening called Gather, and it's a new film that came out about the Indian native food sovereignty movement and food movement. So
I see Adasha has raised a hand.
Yes, I'm sorry. I had to take a phone call and come back, but I had asked some of the questions earlier. It looked like you've already answered them. But in regards to, you know, we're from African descent, and we are not are Christian based, and we are trying to acquire land, and we're learning a lot about the land here in Washington State. So when you were talking about the new pioneers and the new settlers and having that kind of appropriation, we understand completely, because a lot of our culture has been appropriated as well. How do you recommend us going together moving forward, you know, as we're trying to have our own homesteads and bring in our culture and our not really appropriate, but work in collaboration, you know, being that we're reaching out from the, you know, the Horn of Africa, and we're here. And so we're reconnecting with our ancestors, but we're still here on American soil. How do you go about without it being offensive?
you're on indigenous land. Let's go. let's be really clear with how we're talking about that. I am so glad you asked that question. I think that this is one of the most sensitive, and I will even say taboo, conversations in the US, talking about the intersection of Black communities and Black land acquisition,
Yes.
and settler colonialism, and all of it happens on Indigenous land, and this is a very, very difficult conversation, and I see it all the time. I see how it's so hard to talk about, and it's a conversation I am having as often as I can. I will be writing about it in the next book, and I think that now we're talking about what does it mean to be Black, right, and especially to be the descendant of slaves who had come here in chains against their will, without it being a choice, but are here nonetheless. What is that ethical commitment to Indigenous people in their return to land-based practices like farming,
Yes.
and things like that, right? And so I think, I don't begrudge anybody, and I don't think any Native people do, begrudge anybody the right to farm the land. But how are you thinking through your own relationship to the land? And so I would just say that, think about that question. What is your relationship to land and place and to those Indigenous peoples? And, how can you yourself in your community build that kind of relationship that is accountable to Native people? I mean, it's the same principle, right? No matter what race you are. That's the thing about this, is that settler colonialism happens regardless of race. Like, anybody who is here on Turtle Island, right, if you're not Indigenous, then you are a settler of some sort, and you are complicit, or you're benefiting from and potentially complicit in these processes. That's the uncomfortable conversation that I'm talking about, and that's the conversation I'm wanting to open up, and so that we can transcend, have that transformational relationship, and not shy away from it because it's too hard.
Well, can I have those conversations with you? Because that's what we've been trying to do now, is we're talking about reparations, and we don't want just programs for our people. You know what I mean? We're kind of streamlined into the incarceration, institutes, and we're trying to recover from that. And so I had proposed, like, unless we have a spot, for us, or have some kind of, village of our own, we're always going to be paying into a system. You know what I mean? Understand that who we're paying to, it's not their land either. I mean, the land we're looking at is acreage. It's, over 200 acres, and it doesn't belong to, we understand, it doesn't belong to him. So do we go and we ask to partake in, and be recognized in some of the land grants, because some of the language on those acts are for Black and Indigenous people. I think that, other than the HBUs, we're just now waking up to that. And it doesn't want to we don't want to seem like, okay, give us ours, when it's not really ours either. So that's why I tuned into this because we are trying to be somewhat strategic about it, but we have to also consider, like you said, what is our relationship to the land? And it's like going even back from that, a lot of, pre-Pangea, you know what I mean? It's like we're all from one nation. So it's like do we look at, our people different from your people type of thing? Because when we talk about...
That's a slippery slope, though. That's a real slippery slope. I mean, and that in that conversation is the danger of erasure, of erasing Native peoples, tens of thousands of years of land tenure. And so, and I know that that's how it's framed in some extreme radical Black groups. I'm present to some of those conversations, abocentrism and stuff like that. And there's, some pretty out there conversations being had. But You know, I would also refer to you, I did a panel this summer with Bill Fletcher. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a writer. He writes about labor unions. He's Black activist. He's pretty brilliant and sharp. And we did a panel for the Socialism 2020 conference called Reparations for Settler Colonialism and Slavery, where he and I had this conversation in a very public forum, and it was amazing. It was an amazing conversation. And if you just Google on my name and Bill Fletcher, you'll find that conversation
Bill Fletcher.
on YouTube. Yeah, and feel free to reach out to me too if
Yes.
email.
I
I'd love to have that conversation further.
And thank you for that. I was going to, but I figured to introduce myself first before I know you have lots of talks and conversations, so I'll tend to pick up from where you left off and keep going and thinking we know each other and we don't. But I will. I know it's come up in our circles of, you know, just being cautious on everything, and it's so much to consider because we've never really been given a platform, and it's like we want to do it different. We don't want to do it more of the same. And what
the 40 acres and a mule thing was really problematic, right? Like that needed to be thought through.
Yeah.
It's I'm just doing a time check. It's 3:05, and we have a couple more things in the Zoom chat, but
I have time if you want to keep going.
okay. There's a couple of statements about recommending using different terminology that helps, especially around homestead, because the history of that term has so much that doesn't reflect our futures. Homesteading was actually very much against Indigenous people.
Well, it happened on stolen land.
Right. And then also there's a little discourse in the chat between a couple people about it not being fair to label a settler term to those people who were brought here without their will.
No, and I don't do that. But I do talk about complicity, right? And so that's a whole other conversation. Like there's differences between settlers and immigrants, but there's also processes of complicity, of being complicit with that process of settler colonialism. And that's what I'm talking about.
Yes. Yes.
Ilani, could you share about our next program that's coming up before everybody has a chance, or while everybody's here?